Welcome to This Week in Habsland. I'm Jordan, he's Brian, and we are here this week to give our final thoughts on the NHL Draft before it takes place on Friday, June 29th. As usual, you can follow us at Habsland Pod on X, Instagram, and TikTok. So, Brian, we're going to get into this week's episode. We're going to predict the top 5 of the NHL Draft. But before that, there's been quite a bit of news. So I wanted to go through it, obviously through the lens of the Montreal Canadiens. The first one that broke over the weekend was the McGroarty situation with the Winnipeg Jets. That it appears that McGroarty, who has thus far refused to sign an entry-level contract with the Winnipeg Jets for a variety of reasons, might be on the trade block during the draft. What are your thoughts on this, and do you think the Canadiens should pursue a player like McGroarty?
I think definitely they should. This is a player that I liked a lot in the leading up to the 2022 draft. This was a player that was going to fall in between where the Montreal Canadiens were drafting. So it was basically, if he happens to fall to the 20s where the Habs, to 26 where the Habs drafted Mesha, I really wanted him. And then at the University of Michigan, he's been playing pretty darn well. He's improved quite a bit year over year. He had 52 points, 16 of those goals this past year in 36 games. And that's a pretty good amount of points from Rutger McGroarty as a 20-year-old in that league. It was a little hard to tell with the news that was coming out, the exact reason for it, whether it was money related because the Winnipeg Jets have given so much money to players that they're not going to have in a few years, and they haven't kept that much for the future. And so I'm wondering if that's part of it. I'm wondering if it's the fact he doesn't want to go back to university. He wants to play pro now, and they're not allowing for that to occur. And the Jets right now, they believe that they're going for a cup next year, right? They believe that they're in contention, whereas the Montreal Canadiens are maybe 1 or 2 years behind that. So the fit might be there. The Habs are not the only team that would be interested in Rutger's services, that's for sure. But would they be the ones to be able to give the most interesting package to the Jets? Maybe. That remains to be seen. And it also depends what we're willing to give up. I saw some mock trades that had me throwing up. One of them was Gouli for McGroarty, 1-for-1. And then just draft Bouillon. That was the logic behind it of, okay, replace your best defenseman with a good forward and then draft a defenseman who could be better than the defenseman that you currently have. But to your point that you made last week, Jordan, Suzuki's 25, and that's the oldest guy in this group. And so if you're constantly trading away your 22, 23-year-olds for 19 and 20-year-olds and getting younger year over year, you're just delaying when you're actually going to be competing. And so that was more the issue that I had with this. Not only that, I don't think Gouli for McGroarty even makes sense for value-wise. I think that Gouli has proven it, McGroarty has not.
So I think if we're going to break down the reason this is happening for McGroarty, it's really I think it comes down to a disagreement on his development between McGroarty and his camp and the Jets. It seems like he was ready to make the jump to the NHL next year, and the Jets were not fully ready to promise him a role in the NHL, and he doesn't want to be in the AHL, so that seems to be where the breakdown has happened. I'm sure there's much more to it, but that is the general consensus thus far. From a Habs perspective, I mean, McGroarty was an interesting prospect. He was not a good skater coming into the draft, which was a reason that we thought he could fall to the end of the first, even that early second round pick.
Yeah.
It has gotten better. I would still say, from my understanding, it is still not NHL, like projecting to be NHL average, but it's good enough that he was the 14th pick in the draft 2 years ago. He's at least kept that value. And something to keep in mind is if the Jets do not end up signing him and he just leaves as a free agent, they would get as compensation the 47th pick in the draft in 2027. It's a long way out. But just in terms of setting a baseline for what his value would be, it's a mid-second round pick. Now, obviously, I think he'd be worth much more than that. How much I'd want to contribute, how much more I'd want to do if I was the Canadiens, if I valued a player like Rutger McGroarty, I don't know. I do think that 26 and Barron would be something I'd be okay parting with. But I don't think I don't know if that would be enough for the Jets. Also, I should say, like, the Jets are in no immediate hurry to make this trade. They have his rights for 2 more seasons. So, and that mid-second round pick value will stay as the baseline forever. So they're not in a rush necessarily to make the trade this year. Now, like you mentioned, the Jets are still trying to go for it. They have players in their prime. So maybe it's kind of an accidental falling into a trade option where they're like, okay, well, this guy's not going to come play for us anyways. Might as well trade him this year so we can get immediate value out of him. So that might be where the immediate necessity to trade him by the draft would be. I do think if you put Logan Mailloux in a trade, then I think that's really good value. I don't know if you need to add much more than Mailloux. Like, would Mailloux and the Minnesota third do it? The Canadian, I mean, I guess the Colorado second would be their preference, but Mailloux and the 57th pick, or whatever that number is from the Colorado pick, I feel like that's really equivalent value at that point. But again, if I'm the Habs, I don't know. I mean, you also want to make sure that you have assurances that he would actually sign with the Habs and not pull an Adam Fox in Carolina situation where the Hurricanes traded for Adam Fox and he was like, that's great, I'm still not signing with you. So there's a lot of moving parts on it, but I think those are my initial thoughts of I'd be willing to entertain some discussion about it, but I am personally still not in love with the player. So I wouldn't go above and beyond, really.
Well, the skating is worrisome. You said it, Jordan. And for a team like the Canadiens that plays so much counter offense, who the transition is really crucial to the Montreal Canadiens game, it's a worry. And I don't think you can get around that. I like that it's improved, but you're right to say that it's still a worry. So remains to be seen. And then the other thing that I keep mentioning about these trade proposals is oftentimes as Habs fans or analysts or whatever else, we kind of get blinders on of, well, we could offer this, this, and that and get them. Okay, but Winnipeg might also just receive a better offer. Another team might offer something that's worthy of a 14th rather than, like you said, like a 47th. Because technically speaking, that if he doesn't want to play there, if he wants to leave, that's the value. Because if he just walks, that's what they'd get. So absolutely, that's what we have to consider as well, is that another team might not see it that way and might give more than we are, in which case, hey, fair enough. At least we didn't give up Gooley. That's the way I see it.
Right. One more thing on the trade front is I thought there was a really interesting trade proposal from Arpon Basu of The Athletic that I just want to touch on briefly. It's in relation to a Patrick Laine trade, and his proposition was Laine and number 4 for the number 5 pick. No salary retention by the Blue Jackets. What are your thoughts on that?
My initial reaction is that even feasible? Like, wouldn't they want something back? Or from his perspective, it's literally just, we need to get rid of this cap.
Yeah, so I think it would be Don Waddell having just come in and just want to kind of clean slate it. They don't see, maybe they're not in love if the idea is that Lindstrom is the guy who's fallen to 4 and they're not super into the idea of it. Maybe the Habs are, or I don't know. Maybe they don't see much of a difference in like the 4 to 8 zone, or definitely not 4 to 5. Just get that contract off their books, refresh a bit. Columbus is like very much in between two eras. We've talked about this when we did the Laine stuff of they have a glut of guys like 27 to 32, and then they have everybody else 18 to 21. So I don't know what Waddell's going to pick, but in theory, that would at least clear 8.5 off their books. The Canadiens could probably take it in with some price LTIR shenanigans, but I thought it was an interesting proposition. I would definitely be saying yes on it if I was the Habs. If all I'm doing is eating some salary there, I didn't look at what type of cascading effects this would have on the Habs salary cap, but we're mostly just playing with like fake money until the price contract goes away anyway. So
yeah, to an extent, but we also have to sign Slavkovsky. Gooley's another name we have to sign. Jack I. There's a bunch of guys that we have to sign. Some of them on big contracts. Like Slav is going to require close to the amount of money that Laine is getting, if not more, depending on how many years and whether they're doing it based on percentage or whether they're basing it on, Suzuki has to be the highest paid guy still. So I don't know if I see it from a Habs perspective. If there was some type of, we add another player or another draft pick in and they retain $1 million or $2 million, even that small amount of cap retention would help it along, I think, a little bit.
Yeah. So
maybe there's an appetite there. And the fact that Columbus has so many 18, 19, 20-year-olds, like you said, means that they still have a lot of players on ELCs making $900,000 or less, basically, or $950 or less. So they might also be able to stomach $1 to $2 million, depending who they're looking to sign elsewhere.
Yeah, I think, though, at that point, it's not fair value. If it's okay. Laine with salary retention and 4 for 5, then at that point, I think you're Columbus, you maybe look for something different.
No, but that's why you give one of the added superfluous defensemen that the Montreal Canadiens have on the left-hand side, or like a depth forward, or a prospect, something like that. Like you definitely, you're right about that. You'd have to throw something else in if they're going to retain for 2 years, but maybe that's worthwhile.
Right. And then, so last thing on the trade front, this is more of a reaction to the Jacob Markstrom trade where he is going to the New Jersey Devils. There is, I guess, there's a Habs component to this where the Canadiens on both fronts have the New Jersey second or third round pick in 2025, which was contingent on Jake Allen playing 40 games. Seems less likely now, which means it's likely going to go from a second to a third. And then, of course, on the Calgary side, there's the very complicated nature still of that Flames 2025 pick. And what I don't know yet, and I don't know if this has come out, is how the Flames receiving the Devils pick in 2025 will affect everything here. But essentially, the perfect scenario was going to be that the Flames try to make the playoffs next season, barely miss, and the Habs scoop up the 13th or 14th pick. Because that pick is top 10 protected coming to the Canadiens, odds are now that the Flames are, and Brian, tell me if you think I'm going to be wrong, the odds are that the Flames are going to be a bottom dweller in the tank, and that pick will not convey, and therefore the Habs will likely pick up the Panthers pick. Again, it's a very complicated trade, but in essence, there was a chance the Canadiens could pick up a late lotto pick, and it's looking much more now like the Habs are going to pick up a pick in the mid to late 20s.
I think you're right about that. Unless Dustin Wolf steps in and looks like the second coming of Carey Price, they're going to have a little bit of trouble in net. He's still a kid, right? He's still very young. So despite the fact that he's this highly touted goaltending prospect, it's rare for a goalie to come right in and do super well, especially at the level of Markstrom. And then, I mean, the Flames have issues elsewhere, right? It isn't just in goal. They don't trade Markstrom and they're still great everywhere else. And it's just in net. They have issues. They have holes in their lineup. So I think you're right. Unfortunately, if they end 8th or 9th, which is probably pretty likely 7th, like they're not going to be on the same level as the Blackhawks, the Sharks, probably the Jackets or the Ducks, unless some magic happens. I don't think they'll be that bad, but they could probably sit in that like Ottawa zone.
Yeah.
Who just perpetually end up in like between 8 and 12, it seems. So it is looking more and more likely that we do get that Florida pick.
Yeah. And on the Panthers front, I think there is historical precedent for teams making 3 straight deep playoff runs, which the Panthers have had 2 thus far. So Stanley Cup hangover or not, I think, there's a good chance that pick is still going to be 25 to 30, 32 again. So, I mean, it is what it is. This is a free pick the Canadiens got out of absolutely nothing for just taking on Sean Monahan and having him being a Hab for 2 years. So it would be nice if there was a bit better luck in there. And who knows? There's still a variety of things that can happen. But for the most part, this trade, unfortunately for the Canadiens, likely lower the quality of some of their future picks in 2025. Okay, so then let's move on towards the draft. And we're going to do our exercise soon of predicting the top 5 for the upcoming draft. Brian, I want to ask you the question. So 2 weeks ago, you and I did our top 10 prospects for the draft. We disagreed a little bit, but not too much, I don't think. Since that time, we've been able to take in a lot more information. There was the Caden Lindstrom news that we spoke about last week. There is the official height and weight measurements of Ivan Demidov that we got this past week. Has any news, or even just like reading more and watching more tape, do you have any changes to your top 10 since we discussed it a few weeks back?
My top 10 has not changed.
Okay.
To be boring and just stick in the grooves that I've already made for myself, it has not changed. The one thing I was considering changing was having Salayev jump up into the top 10 and maybe take Yzerman's spot in the 10 spot, because he was my 11. But it didn't end up happening because I'm still sort of valuing ceiling. And if Yzerman puts the other pieces together, he could be a dominant scorer. So I just sort of left it status quo, which as we get into our next segment, which is going to be trying to determine, like trying to predict with our crystal ball what the actual top 5 picks are going to be, Salayev will come up in that discussion despite me having him 11. But I think I'm valuing him far less than maybe the GMs in the league are, which fair enough. He has that value. But no, I haven't really changed on anything. Demidov, I had in my 2 spot. I think you had him lower down. So if I could predict maybe what one change for you might be, would it be that, or did you leave him sort of where he was?
Yeah, I do want to talk about Salayev because I think that's a very interesting disconnect that we're seeing so far between maybe the public and what is likely going on behind NHL doors. Yes, Ivan Demidov. So my top 10, my like 5 to 9 group of Parekh, Buyam, Iginla, Dickinson, Seneca, I still feel great about that being kind of the next tier. Obviously with Celebrini up top. My middle tier there, Lindstrom, Levshunov, Demidov. Yeah, so not Lindstrom, but Demidov has been the one guy that I've been looking at with more and more scrutiny over the past couple weeks, and a bit with this Lindstrom news. Like, I don't know what to do with it, really. I know we spoke about it briefly last week of, look, we're not medical professionals. We'll let other people make the decisions here. But if he slides to 7 or 8, I think that's a telling enough story on draft night that, okay, it seems pretty bad, because this is a guy, if he is healthy, he is unquestionably, I think, the number 2 pick. With that said, yeah, I would probably bump Demidov up to the 2 spot at this point. In part because, and look, I know we have had like fun and had discussions about like 5'11", 6 foot. What's the difference? Demidov weighed in or measured in at 6 foot and 1/2 inch. But more importantly, he came in at 190, which I believe I don't know if it was central scouting at the preseason or what, he was weighing under 170. So 190 is more important to me than like he grew an inch. Like, that's, who cares? It's the fact that he's like built out more at 18 years old. He's 190. That to me at least gives me assurances, and I'm sure it gives the Chicago Blackhawks and the Anaheim Ducks and the Columbus Blue Jackets assurances that, okay, we're not going to worry about like fragility here. Like, we know eventually he's going to make the jump to a more physical leagues and smaller rinks, but he at least now has a bit better of a physical profile to match all the amazing stuff he does with the puck. That you can couple that together and see the real projectability of the player, which a lot of people had already seen and we're okay with. I was just a little apprehensive on it, but yeah, with all this extra news, yeah, I'd be okay bumping Demidov up to 2, bumping Lindstrom down to 3, and keeping Levchinov at 4.
On the Demidov topic, I do not see him dropping to the Canadiens as readily now.
Yeah.
The discussion prior to this week was, when he drops to the Canadiens, do they jump on him or do they pass like they did Michkov? Now the discussion is he going to get to them at all? So it's a different discussion. I think it's a less infuriating discussion for some fans, because from some fans' perspective, having the ability to draft him and not doing so would be the most frustrating thing in the world. As we're seeing on Twitter, like a week prior, people are already lamenting that that's what's going to happen and they're upset. Take a chill pill. It hasn't even happened yet. But that discussion has shifted now. I think that discussion revolves around Lindstrom now, and you're absolutely right that it depends on his health. And if he does, drop down a few more picks, we'll know. This is a serious injury that all the GMs and scouts above are worried about, and so it's not worth jumping on him. It also makes it more likely that the Montreal Canadiens end up with Beckett Seneca and TJ Ginla and some other forwards, and potentially even Parik or another defenseman. So sometimes when you lead up to the draft, as the days go by, things solidify. I think they're getting more and more murky as we get closer, because I still have zero idea. I suppose we should probably jump into our next segment, Jordan, instead of beating around the bush, unless you have some other preamble before we get into it, but I think it's going to be fun.
Yeah, I think just generally. So this week I finally let myself look at some mock drafts from, whether it's from the very smart people at like Dober Prospects or Elite Prospects, or even some just fan-made ones. I was really trying to avoid that prior to this to avoid my opinion being affected. What I've seen, I think crucially here, that's like the Bob McKenzie rankings is always a really important one to hold on to. I do think Corey Pronman from The Athletic is also kind of shifting his mock drafts to less of like what I would do if I were the GM, to more of, this is what I'm hearing that this team is going to do, which is the more accurate way to look at a mock draft. What I have noticed, and I've tried to find like, where is the disconnect between what either public facing scouts or fans kind of believe should be the order versus what people are hearing from NHL front offices about what they think is going to be happening. So some of the disconnects are Seneca seems higher on NHL boards rather than public boards. TJ Ginla and Berkeley Catton appear to be dropping. There's a lot of rumblings of Adam Jiricek towards the end of the lottery, which is something we broached the topic last week. And then I think the absolute biggest one is Salayev. And I don't want to get too far into it because I'm sure we're going to mention him really soon, but like the people who are apparently plugged into teams see Salayev as an option as soon as 2, whereas the more public facing boards, even if it's someone like Elite Prospects, they see Salayev more as a like mid lottery pick. I think that's the big swing player. If he jumps into a 3 or a 4 spot, that could have some cascading effects. Same goes for Seneca, right? Like we've kind of come to the agreement that Seneca is a back of the top 10 guy, but there have been reports about him going as high as number 6, which means I'm sure the Canadiens are considering him at 5. So I want to keep that in mind. So as we go into our we're going to do our top 5 predictions. Brian, I want to ask you. So I approach this as what I think the team will do, not what I would do if I was the team.
I did the exact same thing. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so what we're going to do here is Brian and I are both going to predict the top 5 picks. And how we're going to do it is by distributing 10 pucks per pick. So this is a very similar concept to what we've done when we predicted the Habs top 9, or we predicted I believe, all 6 defensemen in 2 or 3 years in the future. So for each pick, there will be 10 pucks, 50 pucks total. And those 10 pucks will distribute to players that we believe are most likely to get picked at those slots. Crucially, one difference it seems like Brian and I are a little bit different on is I gave out some half pucks, which is a terrible practice. Never do that. So that's the only thing I think we might be a little bit different on here. So let's get into it, Brian. At number 1, I can make as many Beckett Seneca, Anton Salayev jokes, but we're obviously both going to have Macklin Celebrini with all 10 pucks. Are we not?
Yes. 10 pucks each for Macklin Celebrini. That makes sense to the Sharks. We've known that since the lottery happened.
He's going to be so good. We haven't really spoken much about him, intentionally so, because, again, he's not going to be a Hab, but he is going to be such a good hockey player. His how responsible he is as a center, as a 17-year-old in a defensive zone. Like that, I found that to be one of the most impressive parts about his season. I know there's all the offensive dynamism, and he knows how to kind of control opposing players with his eyes, with his body fakes. Like he can do all of that stuff already. It's how good he was, I thought, defensively, that 1,000% projects into the NHL. That he's going to be a really special player. He's going to be like an 85 to 95 point guy, I think, within 3 or 4 years. So good on San Jose. All 10 pucks to Celebrini.
Absolutely. He's also not the type of player to rest on his abilities alone. He works harder than anybody. So he's got the talent, but he also has the hard work. And that's a huge factor. That's part of what makes Crosby great.
Yeah.
Is that it's not just the skill, the talent. It's the fact that he goes hard into the corners and he's willing to do everything it takes to win. So yeah, the Sharks have a great one. So, all right, moving on. Chicago Blackhawks. Now, I'm curious, Jordan, did you approach these? I know we're approaching these from the perspective of the teams themselves. Did you do this based on need at all? Because I looked a little bit at what do these teams actually lack, because the picks from 2 to 10 are kind of close together in terms of quality.
Maybe a bit, but truthfully, I think if you're breaking these down, it definitely takes into account Demidov, now that I would have him at number 2, on my own board, he does not have the most pucks for the Blackhawks. But I think, and a part of that is, again, trying to undo this through the exercise of what I think the team will do. But I mean, also when these teams are so bad, their needs are everywhere. They can't choose to be too picky. So I maybe took it a bit into consideration, but not too much. So it was really more about what I am understanding teams where they seem to be leaning, rather than, okay, Anaheim wants a right-handed shot. I mean, it just so happens Artem Levshunov is going to be available in and around that pick. But no, for the most part, I tried to keep it best player available based on what has been reported.
So based on what you've just said, I think you and I are going to be in line with who got the most pucks, and that is Artem Levshunov for me. I gave him 6 pucks for the Blackhawks.
Same.
You gave 6 as well. Okay. So then after that, there's Caden Lindstrom and Demidov, who also have pucks, and I gave them 2 each.
Interesting. So I gave all 4 to Demidov.
Okay. And that's because of the injury risk, correct?
Yeah, it is. In part that I do think that it seems like the decision for the Blackhawks for the past 6 to 8 weeks has been Levshunov or Demidov. So I took that into consideration. I do think they have a slight lean towards Levshunov. That seems to be what's out there. And then when it comes to Lindstrom, yeah, I mean, I don't want to give too much away, but I don't have him getting a puck until the number 4 pick. So again, maybe it's the injury stuff, but I think for Chicago, what I've been understanding, and I think is very legitimate conversation, is do they want a guy who will be, in theory, a number 1 defenseman going forward, or kind of the perfect player to put next to Connor Bedard? So I kind of put it more up to that. And if you're at this number 2 pick, you want to absolutely minimize the risk. And I think Caden Lindstrom poses maybe a bit too much of a risk for them. If you're looking forward a year, the Blackhawks are still going to suck. And next year has a bunch of centers in and around the top 10. So not that you ever want to shoot for fit here, but I think you want to minimize your risk. I think the upside, where they're talking Levshunov, Demidov, Lindstrom, in theory, is all about the same. Different types of players, different roles they fit, but the upside is all about the same. Let's minimize the risk, is what I would do. So I have Levshunov with 6, Demidov at 4. You split Demidov and Lindstrom. Walk me through that.
So we talked, I don't know how long ago, 6 months ago, maybe a year, but we've said this a few times about how the most difficult position and the most important position in your lineup is your number 1 center. The second most important position is your number 2 center. And we kind of said it tongue in cheek, but there is truth to that. And so I thought that having Bedard into Lindstrom as your 1-2 punch not only solidifies your top 2 centers, and that would be one of the most fearsome, assuming Lindstrom stays healthy, that would be one of the most fearsome duos of centers in the entire league. And with the Jackets later, we'll get to another one of those iterations, possibly, if Lindstrom is the pick there with Fantilli. But to go back to the Blackhawks, to have those 2 guys in those spots, they also play different games, right? They're different types of players. And so that gives you versatility too. And so my mentality was they could have 2 of the top centers in the league going forward. That's too good to pass up, despite the fact that they could also just take Demidov and put him next to Bedard and have them score 80, 90, 100 plus points a year for the next 10 years, or Levshunov solidifying their back end in the offensive zone, the defensive zone, in transition, like in all ways. There's not really a bad pick here. I just thought that Lindstrom's abilities are too good to pass up to have that 1-2 punch at center. And so the more I heard you out, the more I think, you're probably right. It is more likely that they do Demidov. Like maybe I was better off doing 3 for Demidov and 1 for Lindstrom, but I don't know. Maybe I like Lindstrom too much.
No, fair enough. At the end of the day, this is going to be a really interesting pick. It's going to decide a couple of the cascading effects of this number 2 pick will be felt, I think, through the Habs pick. If the idea is the perfect world right now, I do think, like if you're looking at a Montreal Canadiens board, I do think Demidov is 2, right? So the ideal world would be obviously to have Levshunov go 2 and then Salayev to slot in somewhere, and then you hope Columbus is in love with someone else, not named Ivan Demidov. So this is an important inflection point, whereas obviously if it goes the other way and Demidov goes 2nd, then it's, okay, then likely Salayev might not go 3 or 4, and unless Columbus likes Salayev, which again, I found Columbus to be the hardest team to kind of figure out in the top 5. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. So I had Levshunov 6 with Demidov 4. I think it's a coin flip between those 2. Let's move on to the next pick. Let's move on to the Anaheim Ducks. And so I had 3 players here get a puck. I know you had quite a few more, so I'll run through mine and you can just tell me what your equivalent numbers are. So obviously I still had Artem Levshunov at 3.5.
So I have 2 for Levshunov.
Okay. So what I'm saying at this point is basically there's a 95% chance that Levshunov is gone by the 3rd pick.
Right.
So I also had Ivan Demidov then with 3.5 as well.
Okay. So Demidov had 3 for me.
And then Anton Salayev got 3 more.
Okay, Salayev has 3 for me as well.
And that is my list. Again, I find Salayev is a very interesting case here where it seems like a lot of the public-facing scouts are not super high on him. Kind of a back half of the lottery type player, a bit of a swing on upside, that he is a projectable top 4 defenseman, but like there's very much a universe where he stays as a number 4 guy, can do some penalty kill, but really not much more than that. He's playing 18 to 20 minutes a game. And which I think is kind of interesting that the public facing side is lower on this guy, but the front offices appear to be much higher on him when he, in theory, would be, I think, a bit more of a risk here. Usually you would assume it would be kind of the other way around. But nonetheless, there's been enough rumblings about Salayev in the top 5 that I had to give him 3 pucks. So mine is Levshunov 3.5, Demidov 3.5, Salayev 3. I'm very much sitting on the fence between those 3 in terms of what I think they will do. So, Brian, how much did that differ from yours?
So those 3 guys have the most pucks for me, but I have less for each because I wanted to give 1 puck each to Bouillon and Dickinson because I've seen enough smoke around those guys with the Ducks that I thought they deserved at least a puck each. I might be shooting myself in the foot once again because you're absolutely right. I think Salayev, Demidov, Levshunov, those are the most likely picks. So I had Salayev with 3, Demidov with 3, and Levshunov with 2 because I do think Levshunov is going in the 2 spot. So I didn't want to give too much there. So Salayev and Demidov with 3 each. I think that matches you, and you had an extra half for Demidov. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, hey, maybe I'll lose half a point to you, but I think those are the most likely. And then I was hedging my bets with Bouillon and Dickinson. Initially I had Parrick as well in there with one puck. I said it's just too many guys. Like,
Right. So it seems like both you and I are leaning towards the Ducks taking a defenseman, regardless. Like if Demidov is there, I think he's going to be in strong consideration. Otherwise, correct me if I'm wrong, neither of us had Caden Lindstrom getting a puck at number 3.
no. Here's why, Jordan. Mason McTavish and Leo Carlson.
Yeah.
We were talking about the Blackhawks having a fearsome duo. The Ducks already have one. They're going to be amazing for a very long time, McTavish and Carlson. So they don't have a need for that. And if there are guys with no health question marks that are nearly as good or as good as Lindstrom, projected to be, why even take the risk? You're stacked at center. So take a winger or take a defenseman.
I think there's been some pretty interesting discussion on Caden Lindstrom's full-time projectability at center, and that some scouts seem to prefer him long-term or as a winger, which I thought was pretty interesting. To me, like, I personally, again, maybe this is Habs-centric, I feel fairly confident in Suzuki and Doc. Now, of course, there's question marks on Doc at this point. There has to be. But to me, it doesn't make much of a difference, right? Like, let me ask you, if Caden Lindstrom is just a winger, not a center, which we don't know. I think probably still most likely he's a center, but there's probably 1 in 3 chance, 1 in 4 chance he becomes just a winger long term. Does that change your outlook on him, or is nothing? Or so let me say it like this: would that change your outlook on him, or is the injury prognosis by far and away the biggest factor right now?
I don't even consider him not being a center.
Okay.
Like, to me, he looks like one of the most natural centers I've ever seen in his draft year. I don't understand the scale. Like, what is their argument that he could pan out as a winger? Just that statistically many centers don't end up playing center at the NHL level, or it's specific to him?
I think it's more specific to him and the way he plays, and if he will have the scanning capability to be a bit more of a distributor. If you look at his goals and assists differential this year, it's not the greatest in terms of what you would like out of a center, but I mean, there's a variety of reasons around that. I also think 2 more years into the WHL will do like a whole heck of a lot of good for him to kind of pan out. Again, he only played about 45 games this year. So again, that's considering all the tournaments, all the postseason, all the regular season and WHL as well. So yeah, that's been the conversation of like, do they think that the hockey smarts can keep up with being a top 6 center, or do you want it to just focus on being a bit of a goal scorer, a bruiser, battle on the boards as a winger? That would be kind of the discussion around it.
So then if that's the discussion, and I'm hearing you out, I'm not that worried. If he's a winger, he's a winger. Like, he looks like an outstanding player. The injury stuff is what worries me the most. So just to come back to that, that's the worry with Caden Lindstrom. It's not going to be his abilities. Again, I don't think he'll have an issue panning out as a center, but maybe we should defer to the scouts that know much more than you and I do and say, hey, fair enough. If they see that there's potential for that, then maybe there's a danger there. But even as a winger, I don't mind Lindstrom at all.
Okay, let's move on to 4, the Blue Jackets, because obviously we want to get to the Habs pick and spend a lot of time on that. So yeah, I'll start off. I'll run through my players. I have 5. So Levshunov at 0.5. That's just basically, I just don't see a universe where he makes it to the Habs pick at 5. So 0.5 pucks to Levshunov. Lindstrom getting 5 pucks. Ivan Demidov getting 2. Again, that's lower because I think there's the chance that he's already gone by then. Anton Salayev still picking up 2 pucks. And then I did throw half a puck to Zeev Bouillon, which, I mean, with hindsight, I don't know, maybe I should like redistribute that to Anton Salayev, but I also just like, I don't have Salayev in a top 10. It feels weird to giving him this much share of the pucks in the 3 and 4 spot. So it's Lindstrom with 5, the odds-on favorite, I think, to go number 4 at this point in the draft. And then if Demidov has slipped, he's probably a player to take. If Levshunov is gone and Demidov is gone, I think there's a universe where Salayev becomes the pick. And then outside chance that they might really like someone like Zeev Bouillon, a solid, reliable, left-handed shot defenseman who needs to do a little bit of work on his skating, but his projectability is through the roof.
I got a very similar list. I have Lindstrom with 5 as well. I gave Demidov 1 more than you did. I gave him 3. And then I split the last 2 pucks, 1 each, Levshunov and Bouillon. I didn't give one to Salayev. Based on what I've seen, it seems as though the Ducks are the most into Salayev. I haven't seen much surrounding the Blue Jackets for him, so I kind of just said, you know what? Bouillon, Levshunov, those are the ones that I've seen for the Jackets, and so let's just leave it at that. But I do think that the most likely scenario, once again, for the 100th time, assuming they hear a positive prognosis for Lindstrom, positive, not as in like positive that he has a problem, but not the medical positive, but optimistic view of his injury situation, I think that's the most likely candidate. And then if Demidov is there and Lindstrom isn't, then that's a shoe-in too. Like those, if either of those two guys makes it to the Canadiens, I'll be super surprised. But that doesn't stop the fact that those are the two top picks for the Canadiens in my 50 pucks distribution, Jordan.
Okay. Yeah, let's get into it. Let's get into the Habs pick, because this is where we want to spend our time. I got 6 players. We spent 2 months on this now, discussing back and forth and reading and watching, and it's still clear as mud, is what I can say. We are now less than a week into the draft, and man, the Lindstrom injury stuff, not to keep bringing it up, I do think throws a bit of a monkey wrench into here. Arpon Basu has been banging the drum that the Habs really like Steve Bouillon for the past 2 or 3 weeks. I think that cannot go unnoticed. Corey Pronman has been, for a while now, mock drafting the Habs to get Ivan Demidov. There's been a bit of Zane Parekh chatter, really not much from the Tija Ginla side. Some stuff with Seneca. I haven't heard anything about Berkeley Catton or Sam Dickinson, really. So tons and tons of players to bring up, Brian. Run through your list for me.
5 less than you. You said you had 6. I have 4. And this perhaps is me being a stickler for wanting a forward, but I only have forwards here.
Okay.
I avoided Bouillon despite that. I think that's a smokescreen. I don't think they're picking a left-handed defenseman. I have Demidov with 3. I have Lindstrom with 3. I have Seneca with 2. And I have Iginla with 2. I don't care that nobody's talking about Iginla. I'm talking about Iginla. I want this kid. And if it's between he and Seneca, for instance, because Demidov and Lindstrom are both gone, and Levshunov is also gone, which we both believe absolutely will be the case, TJ Ginla or Seneca, I'd be happy with either. And it's, I don't know if spooking is the right word, but it's spooking me a little bit that nobody's talking about TJ Ginla anymore. He was the talk of the town a month ago, and that seems to have gone quiet. So I don't really understand that. I still believe in him wholeheartedly. I think Seneca's rise is definitely interesting, and we could definitely talk for several minutes about just what a meteoric rise he has had and why a month ago 2 months ago, we weren't really discussing him at all. He wasn't on our radar, and now he's absolutely potentially a pick at 5. That doesn't change the fact that if either Demidov or Lindstrom falls to 5, and again, with the asterisk of Lindstrom's injury troubles, if either of those guys falls to 5 and you feel comfortable, one of those is becoming a Canadian. How much does this differ from your 6? I assume you have all 4 of these guys in yours.
Yeah.
I'm guessing you got Bouillon as well, and then maybe Parekh as your 6th guy?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, so I basically put a 35% chance the Canadiens are going to take a defenseman. I gave Zeev Bouillon 2.5 pucks. I gave Zane Parekh 1 puck. There's been, Bouillon there's just been a lot of smoke with Bouillon. You mentioned it, that it might be a smokescreen. Why would it be a smokescreen? What benefit would that provide to the Habs? I guess it would be to create value for the pick at 5 for either a flip to 6 or 7.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. If they want to flip with Utah at 6, they can create a stink about Bouillon, gain some extra value, and then draft whatever Tej or Seneca. Like, if they really believe that there's not that much of a degree of separation, it could be that. It's also for the picks above them. If they make it known that they're that interested in Bouillon, and maybe this is a silly thing to say from an outsiding fan's perspective, but if they talk that much about Bouillon, do the Columbus scouts go, geez, Montreal at 5 is really looking into Bouillon. Maybe we should consider him more strongly. What did we miss? So I think it's predominantly, like 95%, it's maybe they make a flip lower down, but it's also to put a little bit of a price tag on him higher up so that maybe Demidov falls. Now, if you're drafting Bouillon over Demidov in the 4 spot as the Jackets, who need forwards as much as they need defensemen, that might be a blunder, but Bouillon also looks great, so who am I to say?
Yeah, I don't know if you're going to Jedi mind trick the Columbus Blue Jackets. I mean, it'd be fantastic if you can Obi-Wan them there and say, just trick them into taking a player who was not named Ivan Demidov and having Demidov fall to 5. So
these are not the players you're looking for.
Exactly. So in theory, yes, that could be a possibility. I think by far and away it would be more of hyping up Ottawa or Utah or someone in that range. And we've talked about it a little bit, like the value of going from like 5 to 7 or 5 to 6. You're going to get a mid-second round pick, and that's about it. I don't know if that's worth the stress of it. I don't know if that's worth all that extra effort. But if you've done your homework and you say, we kind of view, like I kind of do, quite frankly, Parekh, Bouillon, Iginla, all kind of in a cluster together.
Yeah.
If you've done your homework and you say like, look, we're cool with whoever's dropping to 7. Let's just flip it, pick up whatever pick from, again, either it's 6 or 7, get a 46 pick, 42 pick. I don't know how it would work, but maybe that you're okay with that. But for the most part, I think just if you like your guy, take your guy. Don't risk it. So I realized
you ran through the past 15 years of how many times a top, I think it was 6 pick was traded, and it happened 0 times.
Yeah, so
right? It was only as of 7 through 9 that a top 10 pick was ever traded.
Exactly. Yeah, the last time a pick at 5 or better was traded, I believe, was 2009 or 2008. It's been quite a while. So I haven't gone through my actual 10 yet. So I've already talked about Bouillon has 2.5, Parekh has 1, Caden Lindstrom still gets 3. Ivan Demidov only gets the 1, and again, that's much more about the fact that I just don't see him falling to the Habs pick. My remaining 2.5 pucks, 1.5 goes to Seneca, and I still do give 1 to Tij Iginla. So that's kind of where I landed. It's, again, clear as mud is how I'm viewing it. We both have Lindstrom with the most pucks, with each getting, we basically are both saying we think there's a 30% chance that they're going to take Caden Lindstrom. And then it's kind of whatever burger of anybody else that could come up. I guess we've mentioned it before of how would the fan base react to a defenseman getting drafted? Specifically, Zeev Bouillon. Like Parekh, right-handed shot, and I would still rank Zane Parekh above Zeev Bouillon. Like, despite all the great stuff that we hear about Zeev Bouillon, especially the fact that the Habs seem to really like him. Like, the game-breaking ability that Parekh has offensively is just something that Bouillon doesn't have. He might be better in the other 2 zones, but I think there's enough that Parekh showed us in the past couple months that I'm still fully on board with that. But if the Canadiens do take that pick with top 5, let's talk about the ramifications before we start closing out. If it is a defenseman, like, actually, let me phrase it like this. Like, if the player that they draft is not named Ivan Demidov or Caden Lindstrom, my take would be they need to still pick up another forward. Regardless if you're picking Tij or Seneca, I still think you need another guy. We talk about building out the top 9, and we have 3 guys we're very certain of. 1 guy with Kirby Dach we got some questions about health-wise, and then Leroy and Beck are the other 2 that we think are probably projecting to be in the top 9, but we can't be certain until we see it. Just adding Iginla, Seneca, I don't think's enough. Now, if you had Demidov, then I feel completely differently. So if they're walking out of it with none of those guys, if it's Bouillon, if it's Parekh, do we revisit that Rucker McGroarty conversation? Do they like? What is the calculus here? Because there's going to be a lot of moving parts. So the Canadiens need to walk out of Vegas on June 30th with an extra forward, regardless of whether it's the pick at 5 or a trade.
I would say at least one. Like, it would not surprise me if they drafted a forward at 5 and then also traded for an HSM McGroarty or somebody else who's interesting. Like, that's the biggest hole in the organization right now. Like, at defense, you could talk about right D, but with Reinbacher, with Mailloux, and even Barron filling out your sort of maybe 6th defenseman spot, at least for the time being, which as a side note, I think I still have Barron with more potential than most do. I know he's not I know he's not 18 anymore, but I still see his mobility and his smarts just continue to get better. And so if those things improve enough, he could still realistically be a 4th defenseman, but I digress. That would be the other hole other than forward. So like if Lev Shinov falls to 5, which I don't know how the heck he's fallen to 5 anymore. To me he's a head and shoulders above any other defenseman in this class, and he's right-handed, so that adds value. So like if he falls, then they grab him. I'm thrilled. You know what I mean? Because the other thing is, if he falls, it's because Demidov and Lindstrom are probably gone. So if he falls, the Habs get him. I'm thrilled because the defense core is like last year we said, wow, okay, they drafted the best defenseman in the class in Reinbacher. The defense is set now. Yes and no. The question mark is still, is Mailloux or Barron going to be that second right-handed defenseman? There's no doubt in my mind that Lev Shinov to Reinbacher would be maybe the best right-handed pair, at least in terms of like young defensemen in the league. They'd be up there in the top 3 probably of those right-handed pairs. So would I be thrilled with them not drafting a forward? If the guy is Lev Shinov, then I'm thrilled with it. I'm fine with that. If the guy's Parekh, then interesting as hell. I don't see him being able to play with Lane Hudson, for instance. I think that's just too much offense and too much liability on one pair. So maybe it becomes Gooley with Parekh and then Reinbacher and Hudson, and then you have offense and defense all in one, and that's a really brilliant top four. But if the pick is a left-handed defenseman, and I know drafting for need, everybody's going to say this is stupid what I'm about to say, but I don't agree with picking a left-handed defenseman.
Right.
You're just adding to the crop of left-handed defensemen that you have, and I'm not even including Matheson in that because he's an older dude who a couple years from now it might be on another team. And again, I'm not advocating for that. I love Mike Matheson. I love him on this squad, but we currently have 4 NHL proven left-handed defensemen, 5 actually, and then a bunch who are waiting in the wings ready to go.
Yeah.
So I think that's a mistake. So again, I know I just talked for a long time, but to reiterate, it's 1, if not 2 forwards, and then maybe the pick in the 20s or lower down, you take a flyer on a right-handed defenseman who looks like he has a lot of potential. And I ran through some names last time that the ranges are anywhere from like 20 to 60. So you could still potentially get a great one with that 57th pick. Elick potentially. Like there are options in this draft for right-handed defensemen in the late first, late second. So I don't know if I'm sounding silly right now. You know what I mean? Like I honestly don't know what to believe anymore about, like, we just have too many left-handed defensemen, and to draft another one with this probably the last time you're going to be drafting in the top 5, hopefully for the next 15 years, Jordan. That's what we hope, right? That this is the last time the Montreal Canadiens are drafting this high. Hopefully even in the top 10. I'm ready for them to start competing as early as this year. They won't make the playoffs. I don't believe that they will, but if they're close, at least that the Montreal Canadiens are gaining experience in how to get there. So if you use the last top 5 pick that you have for the next 10, 15 years on the strongest position in your organization where you have the most amount of players, I see it almost as a waste.
I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago. They are marching towards an unpopular decision. We just don't know what it's going to be yet. I think that's what we're heading towards. Whether it's trading away a player, whether it's a specific draft pick, they're heading towards it. And it's going to be really interesting to see what they pick. I think it's going to be the right move, but it's going to be unpopular. So very interesting discussion. Let's start wrapping up and actually throw down real predictions. So
cool.
Let's wrap. We'll finish with the Habs. But let me ask you, Brian, who on draft night, relative to where we tend to expect they will be picked, will slide the most? Again, it's always subjective on what you think sliding is. Like, in theory, Caden Lindstrom getting picked 5th or 6th, would that be considered a slide? Probably. But then you have other players, like if Brandon Nygaard goes 19th, I don't know how much you consider that a slide. So which player, if I can throw one name down, that on draft night we're going to be saying like, wow, this guy went at this pick?
So, oh man, I'm stuck between 2 names. I'm stuck between Lindstrom and Catton, because Berkeley Catton on some boards is as high as 2, 3, 4. And neither one of us had him even as like an option among our 5, 6 guys for the 3rd, 4th, 5th pick. So I think Catton's going to fall similar to the way Benson did. The other name is Lindstrom, as I said, for the injury things. I mean, even Yzerman with his scoring prowess, you could throw into that discussion. But I think it's really going to be either Lindstrom or Catton that drops the most. I might defer to you. Who do you think it's going to be? Is it one of those 2 guys?
Yeah, I think it'll be Catton. I think Catton will fall out of the top 10. Which, I mean,
out of the top 10 even. Wow.
Yeah, I think there's a good chance. I think he can go like 12, 13, kind of around then. Again, in part, if there's a big run on defensemen. I think we've talked a little bit about Sam Dickinson, but not really. Very strong candidate, I think, to go in the top 10. Anton Salayev. So if we think, the next question I had was like, who do we think is going to get taken higher than expected? I don't even know what the expectations are with Salayev, because his range can be anywhere from 3 to 15, really.
Yeah.
So I don't know if he would count. Same goes for Adam Jiricek. Like, Jiricek's name's coming up in these mock drafts 10, 12, 14, whereas realistically, the guy missed half a season. There's a lot of question marks around him. He might be better off in the 20s. So
yep. The skating and the knee injury are both troubling.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So like Catton falling, I think that's the most likely scenario there. The other guy is Liam Greentree. Brought it up. I think he's a draft favorite of mine. I think that should be pretty clear if people have listened to the past few episodes. A very real possibility he's there early 20s. Very real, even though I think the talent is much higher than that. So those are the guys I think that might fall. I still think Lindstrom's going 4. At the end of the day, and I don't think 4 would be considered a drop for him. He's in that range. If he falls lower than 5, that's a drop for me, for Lindstrom. who will get taken higher than expected. I mentioned a few names there. I feel like I want to say Sam Dickinson might have a shot of going like 6th, which I think would be viewed as high by some people.
For sure. I mean, I gave him 1 puck for the Ducks at 3.
Right.
I think this all just goes to show how close all these guys are. It's a lot of neck and neck discussions, and it's also a discussion about floor versus ceiling. Like Salayev, it would be my pick for who's going to go much higher than I believe they should.
Yeah.
And that's purely because his floor is as high as anybody else's, not named Macklin Celebrini in this draft, but his ceiling is not half as high as a lot of the other defensemen in this top 10, top 15. So I think that's the discussion. And so, and also as a sidebar, that's why Artyom Levshunov is so interesting, because his floor and ceiling are insanely high. Both, you know, both his floor and ceiling are very, very high. So I think that's why Levshunov as a pick is so attractive. And as I've said 1,000 times, he's a right-handed defenseman. Everybody needs those.
Okay, second to last pick. How many defensemen go in the top 10?
Well, we did an over-under on this, Jordan. I think the over-under was set at 4.5, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
I said under, you said over. This was during our 27th episode of last season, so that would put it...
Early April,
yeah, a couple weeks before the end of the season. I think you're right.
I think it's still over.
I think you're right. You said over. I mean, 5 puts it over. And realistically, the guys that could do it, I mean, Levshunov for sure. Salayev, I think for sure at this point. Buyam for sure. And then that leaves a handful of Parik, Dickinson.
Yakimchuk is the other guy. We've barely talked about Carter Yakimchuk. People like a hard-hitting defenseman from the WHL.
Yeah.
He could sneak into the top 10 as well. Again, the Yarachek buzz has been around. I think Parek's like a guarantee as well. So I think there's 4 guys basically guaranteed to go at this point. Yeah, I still think I think it's the over. It'll be interesting to see if there's a bit of a run. If 2 and 3 are defensemen, and then maybe you have a Lindstrom Demidov break. That's the best case scenario for the Habs, by the way.
Yeah.
And then you might see like Dickinson go 6th. I think like Ottawa drafting Dickinson with their pick, I think is a very strong possibility. I think like Parek going to someone like Seattle would also be something that they would like to do. I'm sure they'll do some backflips on that. I mean, Utah as well. Like, I think there might be a bit of a run, and we might see 6 or 7. So it might just be those top 3. And at which point, like TJ Ginla falling to like 11 or 12, certainly a possibility.
Just like his dad falling way too far. I mean, Jerome was the best player in his draft class. I think there's too many good players in this one, but Iginla could very well be one of the best in this one too. So I'd be very surprised actually if he falls that far, especially because Calgary has a pick in the top 10, and they would love that sort of honoring of his father, grabbing the kid, the same way that I hope the Habs draft Atos Koivu later on in the draft. He's not a first round pick, but absolutely I'd love to see him drafted later on by the Montreal Canadiens, and literally have tears in my eyes the first time I see him possibly wearing number 11 skating around the Montreal Canadiens ice. Like that would be a dream come true. But I think Calgary would feel as strongly, if not more strongly, about getting TJ Ginla there. So
that we'll see. Like that's the most one of the more fascinating ones, that if Ginla's still there at 9 and you just see the Calgary team just sweating bullets over the potential PR disaster of not taking TJ Ginla. So let's end on it. Brian, what is the top 5 ending with the Canadiens? Tell me who are the top 5 picks.
Celebrini 1, of course. Levshunov 2.
I agree, by the way, on those top 2. I agree with that exact order.
Man, I don't know if it's Salayev or Demidov, man. I think it's Salayev, Lindstrom, Demidov. And that's partly because that's what I want to happen.
That's fine.
What I want.
I get that. I think Demidov goes 3, Lindstrom goes 4, and the Habs take Zane Parekh at 5.
Hey, look, I don't hate that either. Right-handed defenseman with his offensive acumen, that's pretty impressive. And look, we're in a situation where we almost can't lose because Seneca, Iginla, Lindstrom, Demidov, Parekh.
Right. So I guess like final question. These are just ad hoc ones now. I've said Zane Parekh, I think is going to be the guy. You've said at this point that you think Demidov is going to be the guy. If it's Zeev Buyam, does he just jump right to the NHL?
Yeah, but they'd have to trade 4 guys, Jordan, to give him space.
Oh yeah, that's right. Well, I can jump him right to Laval, right? It's basically a different area code, but you're basically in the right city.
Yeah, AHL, sure, Laval, but goodness gracious, they'd have to trade, even without getting Buyam. Again, not to start another whole discussion about this, even without getting Buyam, you have to trade somebody, at least 1, maybe 2, maybe 3, if you want room for Hudson, and Engstrom and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah.
I do not see it. That's why I gave no pucks to left-handed defensemen for the Habs. I didn't even give to right-handed because I think Levshunov is gone. I'm regretting a little bit not giving one to Parik though. I think you might be right on the money that if he's there, he's a very interesting pick for the Habs.
Yeah. So I think that'll wrap it up. I think we're, unlike last season's episode where we forgot to actually predict who we thought they were going to take, we said it this year. So it's Demidov and Parik are our predictions. We'll see what happens. We'll be back on draft night to recap what I'm assuming is going to be a crazy few days. I'm sure there's a lot of trades building up. This McGroarty stuff is a bit of a, throwing again. It's the wrench into the engine here, trying to figure out what to do. For a lot of teams, I know there's going to be some UC Saros stuff going around. There's Ullmark stuff with Ottawa making some dumb trades. I'm sure that'll go down greatly. It'll all be very exciting. We'll be here to talk all about it and summarize it all and have some fun with it, hopefully. And I'm just like, one thing, if you're there again, please just bring a piece of paper up so we don't
oh God,
forget the names. It's especially if it's Demidov or if it's Seneca. Seneca is pronounced differently than how it's written. We've all learned that the past few months. So Carrie, please, if you're there, or if it's someone else, right? If it's Brennan Gallagher, if it's anybody else, let's just work on the pronunciation and don't forget the last name.
Yeah.
Anyways, that'll do it for this week's episode of This Week in Habsland. You can follow us on social media at Habsland Pod. We'll be back, as mentioned, on Friday and Saturday for reviewing the first round of the draft. And then, of course, we'll come back for a full draft review after that a few days later. And until then, not until next Monday, but until the draft, go Habs.